Hello everyone, welcome again. So today's lesson will be on the metals module of Year 11 Chemistry. And in today's lesson and in this series, we're going to look at minerals and ores. Okay, so obviously in the topic of metals, we have to talk about what metals are and all those things. But we're also now going to talk about, well, where did these metals come from? And minerals and ores is basically how we take things that we dig out of the ground, particularly here in Australia, and we move them and turn them into useful metals like copper pipe and things like that. Okay, so today's lesson will be on what mineral ores are, hence the title, and we're going to talk a little bit about what is the factors that affect the cost of minerals and what kind of things minerals contain. Okay. So minerals and ores. So minerals are naturally occurring substances, which are usually compounds, with a defined composition or range of compositions and crystal structures. Okay, so what that means is that these minerals are naturally occurring, so you'll find them in the ground somewhere, and they're compounds. Okay, so naturally occurring, they're compounds, which means they're some kind of metal bonded with something else. And of course, because they're compounds, they have a defined composition, but because they're essentially mixtures of rock, you can have sort of a range of different compositions that can be called ores of a particular metal. So for instance, you could have several different types of iron ore, but they're still called iron ore. They're just different types of iron ore. So you can see they can have a range of compositions. And obviously, because they have different composition, they'll have slightly different crystal structures. Okay? So that's how we define a mineral. It's just any naturally occurring substance with a defined composition in the ground. Okay, minerals usually contain metals. Okay, so obviously that's why we're talking about them, because they usually contain metals in an oxidized form, such as oxides, carbonates, silicates, sulfides, and sulfates. Okay, so iron sulfide is one mineral, and it's what we call fool's gold. You could have obviously iron oxide, which is like rust. You can have all sorts of different carbonates, like limestone is limestone is calcium carbonate. So you can have lots of different types of minerals based on a metal being bonded to any one of these substances. Now the difference between a mineral and an ore is that an ore is defined as a naturally occurring deposit that is a mixture of minerals from which a substance, in this case a metal, can be economically extracted. Okay? So a mineral becomes an ore when there's enough of it in the ground in a particular area that we can mine it and make profit out of. Okay, so ore is so using the word ore is for more of an economic point of view, whereas a mineral is more of a broad category for nearly every metal compound in the soil. Okay, so ore is for money, and mineral is sort of more like a chemistry word. Okay, so ores and their constituent minerals form as the result of a variety of geological processes. Okay, so we have ores simply because of the geological processes going on in the earth. So we know that the earth is made of rock, and those rocks are very dense, so they're in the middle, and sometimes they can sort of meander their way up to the crust, and then geological processes give us these ores. Okay, so that's where they come from, just the natural workings of the earth's different levels. Okay, so the economics of minerals, so hopefully there's some economics students watching as well, because this should be all very familiar to you. So how economic a mineral deposit will be is based on a variety of factors. So the first one is the type of mineral. And that makes sense, because if, for instance, I had, say, some kind of, let's say, silver mineral. I know silver occurs mostly in natural form, its actual silver form, but let's just say it doesn't. If I had a big deposit of silver and an equally big deposit of, say, iron, the silver will be more expensive. The final product of silver I could sell for more than I could sell the iron. So the type of mineral makes a big difference. Also, different types of minerals have different amounts of a particular substance. So if I had a mineral that was 1% iron compared to a mineral that was maybe 50% iron, obviously the 50% iron mineral is better than the 1% iron because there's just more iron per unit of volume. So the type of mineral makes a big difference in the economics. The quantity of the mineral. So if you have a very, very big deposit or a very small deposit, that changes the economics. So generally you want very big deposits so you can sell a large amount. And also you can use bigger equipment, which is a little bit more efficient. So you can make a little bit more money. So quantity is a big thing, is a very important factor. The mining process and technological advantages. So some mining processes are more advanced than others. So if you have a sort of smallish deposit, if you have a good mining process, you can actually make that very useful to you. Even though the deposit itself is small, your mining technique is so efficient that that's still economical for you. Okay, so how good your mining process will make a big difference to how economic a mineral deposit will be. Demand for mineral. Okay, so we've talked about all the sort of technical reasons here as to what affects the economics, but what about the non-technical reasons or the market-related reasons? So obviously, if you have no demand for your mineral, that is a very big factor in determining how much you can sell your mineral for. Okay, so economics students, supply and demand. If you have no demand, then no one's going to buy it. And if no one buys it, it's not economic, no matter how good either of these three is. So you could have a very good quantity of mineral, an excellent type of mineral, a super good mining process, but if you have no demand, then all of this is pointless. Okay? So demand for minerals is a very big thing, but luckily lots of countries and lots of people want minerals so they can make things out of them. So that is rarely a problem. And of course, the economics is the price of the refined mineral. So once we have the mineral, we've taken the metal out, how much is that metal worth? If it's worth a lot, well then, we could sell it, and that mineral deposit, even though it may not have all of these, could still be useful. Or if we had a very, very good, if we had a very low cost, we could sell this refined mineral for very little, then all of these things become less useful. Okay, so we'll need a very big deposit so that we could sell a lot of this metal. We'd need, a very good quality deposit so that it didn't take much effort to get the metal out. And we need a lot of demand. Okay, so these two are kind of linked together. Okay, so the commercial price of metals. So the price of metal is dependent on a variety of factors, obviously, as we kind of mentioned in the previous slide. But the two major factors include abundance and the relative cost of production. Okay, so the abundance is related to the demand. So if you have a lot of a particular mineral, then you tend to sell it for less if the demand is very low. But if the demand is very high and you have a lot, then you can sell it for slightly more. And obviously the relative cost of production. If you have a mineral that's very, very hard to extract the metal, like aluminium, it will cost more than a metal that's very easy to extract, like iron. Okay, so the relative cost of production is a very big deal. Okay, so the abundance thing. So the more abundant the metal is, the more likely its price will be lower. Okay, so if we just go down this way, the demand is the blue line. As we go down, as we lose demand, basically the quantity goes up. Okay, so as the quantity increases, the demand is less important, or the price is lower because the demand stays the same. Okay, so this is just a standard supply and demand curve for the economics kids. So the more abundant you have, the higher the quantity, the more likely the price will be lower, as you can see. When it hits the demand curve, the price is lower. So of course it's related to supply and demand. However, the relative cost of production does play a role in determining the final price of the metal, as I mentioned before. These two, the abundance and the cost of production, sort of interact with one another to give you the final price. Okay? So the cost of production is the other major factor. If a metal is extremely abundant but hard to refine, then the price may still remain high. And aluminium is one such case of that. We have a lot of aluminium in the soil, but it's so hard to extract that it tends to still be quite expensive. Another one, common one, is silicon. It's considerably more abundant in the Earth's crust than iron. So silicon is everywhere. If you go down to your local beach, I don't know, Balmoral, Coogee, Maroubra, Bondi, any of the major beaches in Australia, or in Sydney even, you'll be walking down on a bunch of silicon. Because sand is silicon dioxide. So we have a lot of silicon available to us. However, to refine silicon from sand to industrial grade silicon, or even semiconductor grade silicon, is a very costly process. It takes a lot of energy because the silicon has to be absurdly pure for semiconductor devices. So for your computer, which you're watching me talk on, the chips in your computer have an insanely high purity silicon in them that have been purposely contaminated with other substances. And the reason why is because it helps us control the electricity. And so you can see all the things that you're seeing. So in order to be able to control electrons, you need to have an insanely pure silicon. Okay? So obviously if you want super pure silicon, you have to put a lot of effort in, and that's why silicon is still very expensive compared to many other metals. Okay, and now we're going to talk about ores and renewable resources. So as a renewable energy engineer, I deal a lot with renewable resources, and so a renewable resource is anything that replenishes through natural processes with the passage of time. Okay. Now, mineral ores are not considered renewable because they're not replenished. We can't just all of a sudden get more copper in the soil. That doesn't happen. We can get more plants in the soil, and then we can cut the plants down and then grow a new set of plants. So that's a renewable cycle. You can see that the plants are constantly being refreshed. But you can't do that with ores. So that's why they're not renewable. Now, even with recycling, metals cannot be recovered 100%, so you still can't call them renewable, or at least cyclical, because we're not good enough to extract 100% of our metal during the recycling process. So we can't really call any metal renewable because we can't recover them at all. Okay? So that concludes today's lesson on minerals and ores. We looked at what a mineral is, what an ore is, and what the different factors that affect their price, and also their non-renewable nature. So we covered a lot of different things, but they all kind of link together, and they're all quite intuitive in their own way. So we'll move on to the question segment now. So question 1. Explain why the price of metal is related to both the abundance of that metal and the refinement production methods. Okay, so why is the price related to both and not just one or the other? Okay, well, the abundance of a metal contributes to the price of a metal through the concept of supply and demand. So if we have a lot of metal and not a lot of demand, we have to sell it for less, because otherwise we're not going to get rid of it. Alternatively, we could have a very little amount of metal but a very big demand, so we can charge whatever we want for it because we know someone's going to buy it. Okay, so that's the kind of logic that Apple takes up sometimes, I feel, because they sell for very high prices because their demand for those products is very high. Okay, so they can afford to sell for high prices because they know people will still buy it. Okay. Now, if there's a large supply but little demand, the price will be low, and obviously vice versa, as I mentioned. However, the production method plays a large role in determining the price of metal. Now, silicon, while it's not a metal, is a good example, is extremely sought after. So Intel, AMD, Global Foundries, TMSC, all these big semiconductor companies, they all buy silicon. And so the demand is huge. And also we have a huge abundance of it because, you just look at your beach, there's tons and tons of sand everywhere. But the cost of refinement is also really, really high because it takes a lot of energy to refine this silicon. So both the price and production methods both need to be accounted for. Silicon is still extremely expensive to buy in ingot form. So to buy a lump of silicon, of pure silicon, it still costs a lot. Okay, so that's why, because the cost of production is so high, even though the abundance is equally high. Okay. Explain why even with recycling, metals are a non-renewable resource. Well, there is no process available that can extract metals from waste with 100% purity. So we can't, if I have a can of aluminium and I melt it down, turn it into a block of aluminium, that block of aluminium will be slightly less than the can that I started with. And that's just a consequence of the losses that we experience in our system. Just like when you put petrol into your car, not all of that petrol energy goes into your car moving. Okay? Some of it's wasted as heat, some of it's wasted as friction and other things. So in science, we often, or in engineering at least, we can never quite get 100%. We can come close, and there are some things that are really, really close, but we can never get 100% because the world is not perfect. So we can't extract 100% of the waste into metal again. So that means some metal is lost after each use, and therefore the total amount of usable metal is still reducing. Okay, so the total amount of metal that we have is reducing. So because it's reducing, metals can't be considered renewable resources. Renewable resources would sort of be like, if you would talk about them mathematically, they'd be constant over the time. Okay, so over this length of time, the renewable resource will remain constant. The rate at which it's being consumed will sort of equal the rate it's being regrown. Whereas metals, you can only consume them, so they'll only decrease. Okay. So name 2 factors that influence the economics of a mineral deposit and explain how they influence the economics. Okay? So one could be the quality of the deposit. If there is more usable metal in a particular mineral deposit, then it will be cheaper to extract a given mass of metal. So if there's more of a particular metal in a mineral deposit, for say, if I wanted to get 1,000 kilograms of that metal out of that mineral deposit, it's probably easier. I don't have to dig out as much, okay? If there's less, I have to dig out more of the surrounding area to find more minerals, okay? The type of mineral. So different metals are required by industry in differing amounts. Therefore, a substance in high demand may be worthwhile to extract, even if the ore is of poor quality. So what type of mineral it is can be a big defining factor. For instance, things like diamonds, they go for a very high price. So you could have a very poor quality deposit of diamond, but it still may be worthwhile to dig out because each of those diamonds could sell for a lot. So you can see that the type of mineral plays a big role in how much or how economic a mineral deposit is. And the mining technology. So how effective the mining technology is obviously affects the economics of the deposit. Highly efficient method may allow low quality deposits to be mined economically. So even if we have an extremely high, so if we had a really high efficient method, something that's really, really good at extracting this metal or mineral, then even really low quality deposits could be mined economically, whereas using older technology, that may not be true. Okay. Silicon is one of the most abundant metals in the Earth's crust. The process to refine silicon is incredibly energy intensive. Explain why silicon is much more expensive than a less abundant element like iron. Well, while silicon is extremely abundant, it's abundant in a form that's not easy to refine. So the sand is actually very difficult to refine. Now silicon, which is sand, silicon dioxide, which is sand, is incredibly hard to change, and so requires substantial energy input to obtain pure silicon. So when we have silicon dioxide, even though it's so abundant, it's actually very difficult to change into pure silicon. So you have to put a lot of energy into the process in order to get it to go into silicon form. Now iron, on the other hand, is abundant in many areas in a form much easier to refine. So iron is a lot easier to refine in general. This reduces the operational cost of iron, meaning that its total cost is lower than silicon despite its higher scarcity. So it's less abundant, but it's so much easier to refine that the total cost is less than the total cost of silicon. Okay, so that's just one reason, and okay, so that's why silicon is a lot more expensive, simply because it's harder to refine. Explain how the historical use of a metal has impacted on the relative price of that metal in the current market. Okay, so this is quite an economic-y type question. Well, metals that have had long developmental histories like iron and copper are usually significantly cheaper than metals that have not been present in industry for as long, like aluminium. So if you think about back into the old days, iron has been around for a long time. You think about iron, it's steel. Steel has been used, in the medieval times. Knights wore armor made of steel. They wielded swords made of steel. And even before that, copper was being used, usually in the form of brass or bronze. When it's alloyed with some other metals, you get bronze or brass. So that's been used for even longer than iron. So they're obviously going to know, so humans are going to know how to extract this copper or iron more effectively than they know how to extract different metals like aluminium, because we haven't had as long to deal with aluminium as we have with iron and copper. So the reason for this is that humans have continued to use these elements, and the production processes have evolved accordingly. Okay, so as we've continued to use them, the processes that go into refining the copper and iron have actually evolved as well. They've gotten better. Whereas aluminium is sort of starting from scratch. We're like, oh, okay, we found this deposit. Well, we're going to have to figure out a new way of getting it out of the deposit into aluminium metal form. So that's going to take some time, and it's going to cost some money. So obviously, it'll be more expensive than copper or iron. Therefore, the cost of these long utilized materials is low, since the production costs are very low. Okay, so the production costs are low because we've had such a long time to deal with them. So in general, the total cost will be low for the ones that have been utilized for a long period of time. Okay, so that concludes today's lesson on minerals and ores. We looked at what a mineral is, what an ore is, and what are some of the factors that affect the price and economics of how these minerals and ores are mined. So in the future lessons, we'll be talking about different extraction processes as well as recycling. So I look forward to seeing you at our next lesson.